The People's Platform.
My guest this evening is Radhika Hettiarachchi, public historian. Good evening and welcome to the show, Radhika.
Thank you for having me.
Radhika, much of your work revolves around challenging dominant narratives. Tell us, what does this entail in the Sri Lankan context?
In answer to your question, I think in terms of the Sri Lankan context, challenging dominant myths and narratives, for me, essentially means working around the issues of conflict and post-war Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, I think at the end of the war, the kind of narrativization that was being created was trying to, in many ways, create a dominant narrative about the end of the war that was, I would say, influenced by victory. So it's a victor's perspective in a lot of ways. And this kind of narrativization marginalizes or leaves out entire experiences of people. And one of those groups is women. In a lot of ways, because of the way the war ended, the kind of narrativization has a masculine lens to it, and it doesn't necessarily capture women's histories, lived experiences of conflict. If women's histories are shared, or if women's stories are seen in the public sphere, most often those are stories of victimhood rather than, let's say, survival and courage. So I think most of us have seen images throughout where the kind of visual narrativization that you see in the public sphere of women's experiences of conflict usually are scenes of mothers who are crying at memorials, for example. And that really is sort of a visualization of a narrative of mothers suffering or grief as a nation suffering or grief. It helps to build a nation-building narrative that legitimizes the end of the war and legitimizes the way it is seen in the public sphere. But what is missing in those narratives is also that women are courageous, women are survivors, women are strong, and their lived experience covers much more than just their grief or the worst days of their lives. There is much, much more that is hidden from that narrative. So in documenting women's histories, using particularly arts-based methodologies that allows for different versions of women's experiences of war to come out, it allows us to see the role women have played, the agency with which they work in a different light.
Radhika, it's so interesting when we look at history and how history has resulted in the erasure of women, the subjugation of women, the suppression and policing of women. And to date, this continues. So how does your work challenge this? How does your work bring the women into the conversation? How does your work make the women understand that their stories, their lived experiences are also a part of reality, are also a part of history, are also going to form a part of our collective future?
I think one of the ways in which that happens automatically in the process of listening to and documenting all these different types of histories is that women's histories are not monolithic. There are many, many different ways in which women have engaged, but also within the person itself, there are many different ways in which the person chooses to express their experiences, right? It's never really one thing. But in terms of recognizing that these lived experiences, they're not just in the past, because in a lot of ways, particularly with histories of violence, that stays on with you until it's dealt with, it's actually resolved. And for a lot of these women, when they share their life histories, it's not necessarily about just being visible in that sphere. It's also about acknowledgement. It's about a legal framework of accountability. It's about answers to questions of what happened, for example, in their own personal lives. And interestingly, by bringing in the way people remember their own lives, perspectives, if you will, to the understanding of our history, what it does is that it fleshes out figures and numbers and facts. It makes it real, it makes it human. And I think one of the other things that's really important to realize is that the past is not really in the past. So it is about dealing with the past in the present. All of these traumas are intergenerational, they carry on unless we actually address it. So for example, with some of the women that I work with, in terms of sexual violence and people who engaged in sex work during the conflict, for example, that it resonates with the present, because the reason that some of them can't come forward to talk about the kind of violence they've experienced is because it is still in a lot of ways considered a taboo subject. So unless we actually address this and deal with it, it's very difficult for them to engage in and talk about the violence that they have experienced. So, for example, with the sex workers themselves and the kind of violence they've experienced, in many facets of Sri Lankan society, people think it is illegal. So, even though it is actually not legally
Soliciting, that's illegal, and running a brothel.
Running a brothel is illegal. Soliciting in a public place in a riotous manner is illegal. So being a sex worker isn't a status crime, which means you shouldn't be arrested for it. But because this environment exists, people who worked in the sex industry during the war, who have actually suffered sexual violence because it is such a closed environment where you can't really see what happens, they can't really come forward to address that issue. And for them, then, it's about what does these memories, what do these oral histories, what do these memories have to do with the present? And with the present, what it does is it actually enables us to talk about the things that we can change, the things that we can see, which is that behind these women who share these stories, not just sex workers, there are real people, real concerns, real issues. And that is something that we as a society need to be active in listening, active in addressing. But if you think about sex workers, that means actually to look at sex work as work, because then if you're sexually violated at your workplace, and the woman's workplace is the site of work is her body. If you're actually violated beyond the consensual agreement, then you can actually say that is violation above work, right? So it's about why I'm saying this is because dealing with the past, documenting the past, has resonance to the present and the way we see and the way we feel and the way we can shape our society.
Radhika, share your perspectives also about society and how it fetishizes women's victimhood.
I think actually what we talked about earlier about the way, women's victimhood is placed in the context of nationalism, for example, in the context of loss. It is a way of sort of legitimizing the end result, in a way, to say it's a way to legitimize a certain type of narrative and a certain type of victory. So in the context of victimhood, yes, sometimes it is used, but often I find that women themselves use victimhood as they claim their agency. They use victimhood as well because there are tools. It's another tool to become visible in the search for answers, right? Because you have different platforms. You have, for example, for the mothers that disappeared, you've got events, you've got meetings, you've got rallies and protests, but sharing your history on another platform is another way to say, I'm still waiting for answers. And that is not necessarily victimhood that is without agency. It is claiming that as a group identity to say, I'm still waiting for the answers. Where is my loved one? And in a sense, I think what is problematic is that when victimhood is used further agendas of power. But when victims themselves choose to use it as a strength, then I think there are nuances to that that we have to understand exist.
Radhika, your work is quite specialized and niche. What I want to ask you is, and also very important and crucial for Sri Lanka, thank you for doing this difficult work, which gets lost in the wayside and has in the past. How do you think we need to go about mainstreaming this work? Because when those whose voices haven't been heard see the work that you've been doing, they will also feel that sense of legitimacy. And speak to us also about how your work intersects with the greater societal landscape and policy.
I think one of the things that this work does in terms of engaging in with the greater society is that there is having these people's histories out there, particularly at the National Archives and in the public sphere, is in a way making sure that future generations that look back on our history is not just reading the black and white textbooks and not thinking that this is all that matters and this is a narrative that exists and this is the only truth. It's about making sure that there are many different truths and many different kinds of subjective experiences, and that history is also perspective. Where are you looking at it from, and who you are and who's asking, and what it means for you to be part of history. So in a sense, these people's experiences as a collection, when they're in the public sphere, enables us now and our future generations to look back on it as more than just what we were told. So it actually makes us question, is everything we think we know the truth? In answer to that second part of the question that you were talking about in terms of policy implications of this kind of work, I think what it does in a way is that it allows the women that have experienced and lived these experiences to be able to strengthen their voice, to amplify their voice. And that enables all of us to work as a community towards focusing on the things that the women need changed in the public sphere for them, in terms of service delivery, in terms of accountability, in terms of community healthcare, all of those different aspects of life that are affected by the legacies of conflict and violence. They can then work towards that, and this kind of public history perspective allows for real stories to engage, or real stories to be engaged in that process.
Radhika Hettiarachchi, thank you for this conversation. Welcome back to the show. I'm in conversation with Peter Godwin, award-winning Zimbabwean author, journalist, screenwriter, documentary filmmaker, and a former human rights lawyer. Hello and welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Peter, much of your work delves into Zimbabwe's complex history. You speak of the traumatic impacts of Mugabe's rule, and you juxtapose this with the resilience of everyday Zimbabweans. Here in Sri Lanka, we too have gone through a turbulent past, a political past. So these have a lot of resonance for Sri Lankans as well. When you documented this in your writing, did you have to fight the urge to be analytical and lawyer-like? How did you allow your emotions to take free rein? Take us through this process.
It's an interesting question. From a sort of literary point of view, I did the story first as in fact, I did the story first as a lawyer, as a human rights lawyer, defending some of the black Zimbabwean leadership who opposed Mugabe after independence in 1980. So I had that perspective. Then I became a journalist, and I wrote about the genocide in the South as a journalist, trying to expose it and amplify it and get it to stop. And then finally, I started to write about it all in books, in memoirs. And I think I did that because there's something you can get at in the literary form, something deeper and more emotional than you can access as a journalist. As a journalist, you know, you're doing the daily stuff, and even if you do long form things, there's a limit to what you're allowed to do somehow by the form. It's more constrained. And in a book, in a memoir, it's just you can tell the story any way you want, in the most effective way, and you can, as you suggest, make it more emotional. You can get into the heart of something. Of course, everybody has their truths. I mean, I wrote about it as I saw it. In an ideal situation, everybody else also writes their truths, and then we get these different books and these different voices, and the overall truth lies, you know, in between them all somehow. But I do find that the literary form, I do find that there's something quite unique about books, about literature, that you can access. You can really access the human heart.
You speak of accessing the human heart, but one of the pivotal problems of society is its collective desensitization towards grief, towards harms, when it's happening to the other.
Yes, it's that classic thing, isn't it? When it's not directly happening to you, it's easier and often safer, you think, to ignore it, or at least not to push yourself to the front. Zimbabweans, you know, Zimbabwe as a nation, I think, is traumatized. It's a nation that was born into war. It had, you know, it had segregation, and then it had an independence war for nearly 10 years, from 1972 through to 1980. Then it had another kind of really a war or genocide in the south of the country, and then it had, you know, an autocracy. It's not really a democracy, Zimbabwe. It does that thing where it has sham elections, and, you know, they're rigged, or they're doctored in such a way that it pretends to be a democracy, but it really isn't. There's no way that the ruling party will ever give up power. And so people become slightly numbed to that. They start to lose confidence in their ability to change anything, certainly without violence. And I think they stop being full citizens. What happens in countries like Zimbabwe when in this situation is that many of the best and the brightest leave the country. They leave and they go into a diaspora, to South Africa, to England, to all over the world. And then they send money home. And those remittances really provide the core, the economic core of Zimbabwe's, insofar as it survives at all, and it's a failed state. It's because of all these Zimbabweans who've been pushed out into the diaspora, sending money back to their families.
Post Mugabe, how is history being told? What are the voices that are being erased? What are the memories that are being deleted? And what are the lessons that have been learned?
I mean, we aren't really post-Mugabe at all, because the person who's taken over, Mnangagwa, was Mugabe's henchman. So in a sense, we're still in the Mugabe era. We've just changed one figure at the top, and now Mugabe's dead, obviously. So nothing has really changed about the way they present history. It's a way in which no one else has any room. They lionize themselves and act sort of in a fairly messianic way. So there's no real freedom there, and there isn't really freedom of the media either. There's no there's no independent radio stations or television stations or whatever. So they control. There's a very tight control over the media, and of course people can find out what happens in this way and that. But Zimbabweans know to be very careful, and to be careful what they say in public and things. And I think eventually, most people spend most of their lives just trying to survive. There's shortages and things, and that can just keep you in a permanently kind of exhausted position, so that you just don't have the energy to, and most people are just in survival mode, I think, and, even after all these years.
Do you at all see a resurgence among youth? We saw it in Sri Lanka right after and to the point leading up to the economic upheaval, where the youth galvanized against the government at the time. And right now there is a continuation of that resurgence where young people are interested in learning about legal reform, about economic recovery. Do you see this resurgence of sorts in Zimbabwe?
I mean, I think young Zimbabweans are interested, and I think they do find out. And I think when you talk to them one at a time and things, you know, they're very they're knowledgeable, and they would love to see change. But the reality in Zimbabwe is that you can do some of that. You can dissent to a certain point. But if you reach the stage where you're a real threat to the government, they resort to violence, and they will arrest you and they'll put you in prison. And they have, you know, they have very, very draconian laws that just, you know, so everybody understands that the room for maneuver, the room for dissent is extremely limited, is extremely curtailed. And so often Zimbabweans, you know, do leave the country, or they eventually get absorbed into the system. If they're in the elite, they get absorbed into that system. It's a very corrupt, it's a kleptocratic country, and you know, it's such a shame because it has enormous potential. It has amazing resources, natural resources, and it had the best education system in Africa. It had the highest literacy rates in the whole continent, but that's starting to tail off now.
In Sri Lanka, one of the conversations that we've been having for the past 2 or 3 years has been system change. And I'm interested to know, is that a conversation that is being had in Zimbabwe?
It's a conversation, but it never gets anywhere near being a reality. It just doesn't. All the levers of control are very firmly held in the government hands. I have this theory about the difference in countries. I mean, this is really looking at Africa, where a nation has had to fight a war to get independence. The group that fights that war, the political organization, when they take over as the first government of an independent country, they feel like they do have this sort of almost divine right of kings.
Yeah.
And so they say to the opposition, you know, they say to everybody, if it weren't for us, you wouldn't be independent. Ergo, we can do no wrong. You know, so, and it's a circular argument. You can never get past it, you know.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, something happened in South Africa that was really interesting in the last election. South Africa was gearing up to a war, the townships were burning, but it didn't actually go into a full-scale civil war. It stopped just short of it and got its independence and pushed aside apartheid. And the ANC was obviously the primary opposition to apartheid, etc., etc. But they are losing support, and they in the last elections they've been forced to go into a government of national unity and bring other governments in, and I think that's been very good for South Africa, because you have to negotiate with the stakeholders and the communities and things, and that's really what democracy is. It's messy, and it's not convenient, and it's difficult to get things done. But that sort of messy figuring out a consensus is really what prevents a country from becoming violent, because everybody feels like they have an input and they have a voice.
We're looking at Trump's America. We're looking at a world that's warring, essentially.
Yes, I mean,
how do we reconcile?
Trump's America, you know, we're in an age of these new populist sort of, you know, populist. In Europe we're seeing it, but Trump obviously is the best example. And it's really something, it's quite interesting watching, because he's essentially an entertainer. He's not really a politician. He's an entertainer. His instincts are those of an entertainer. And so it's quite interesting, you know, to see him poking. He does things which, you know, like the latest thing on Gaza or whatever, he puts out something that's absurd, and then everybody, you know, and the thing is, if you keep doing that, eventually people become desensitized, or they live in a permanent state of moral outrage, which is unable, where the volume is permanently turned to 10, and you know, you can't distinguish, and eventually you start to sort of, you get numbed, I suppose. The thing, I live in New York, as you said. I've been living in New York for nearly 30 years now, and if you're not American and you go to America, as I've done, one of the first things you realize is just how important states' rights are, as opposed to the federal. That there are two systems that live there, and the states' rights are very well enshrined in the Constitution, etc., etc. So if you live in a state like New York or California, which are democratically ruled, you're to some extent you're protected, but as we're finding now on a federal level, Trump has is determined to sort of dismantle as much of the federal government as he can. So I think Americans are fairly traumatized, and I think even the people who voted for Trump, and he obviously won these elections, it's going to be interesting, I think, in the same way that a lot of people who voted for Brexit in England later didn't like the consequences of pulling out of the EU, but they hadn't fully thought it through or whatever. So it's going to be it's going to be a very interesting 4 years in America for sure.
How do we bridge this divide?
It's interesting because in some ways with the internet and everything, there's more information out there than ever before. But the problem is that the way the algorithms work, they create digital fish traps for each person. So the more that the algorithm senses what you like and what it starts to feed you that sort of information, whether you're right wing, whether you're left wing, whether you like this or that. And it does it across the board, not just on politics, but everything, where you buy things. And the problem with that is that it slowly closes your mind, whoever you are. It stops presenting you with challenges and opposing views and whatever. And I've noticed that Americans have become much less tolerant for views that differ from their own. People don't really debate anymore. Politics has become almost tribal in a sense. And the way the internet algorithms of the main digital stuff works is that they encourage that. So it's a really odd, it's counterintuitive. You've got more information out there than ever before, but yet it's less honestly curated. It's done as a consumer thing. So in America it's very hard when people of different views come together. Nobody's changing anybody's mind. It's just they're talking past each other. So that is a strange, and I think one of the things that we're in danger of losing, and I think why it's really important to keep it in schools, is the art of debate, is the art of rhetoric, of the art of actually Socratically arguing about something. It's evidence-based, causational, whatever. Not just I read this, I think this. It's not that, and we're in danger of losing that. And I think it's really important that schools keep up debating societies and learn just how you do that and how you change your mind, and they make you debate something from the view that you oppose personally, just so you can see how you can construct an argument that doesn't happen to be there. And also there's a real strength in changing your mind. There's no dishonor in changing. I mean, changing your mind is the mark of intelligence, where you can say, I used to think that, now I've got this bits of evidence and I'm changing my mind. It's fine.
Living in New York, looking at Zimbabwe from the outside, are you less angry? Are you less emotional?
I mean, I'm less emotional about it in general, unless but not in a good way, in a sort of, in a kind of way that I'm resigned to the fact that, in my career and everything I've tried to do, both, as a human rights lawyer, as a journalist, and finally as a memoirist and as a writer, I went through a period of activism. I did what I could, but I have to admit at this point, I don't think I managed to move the needle at all. I mean, it's just the truth. And there's a point at which, other people are coming up behind me and, doing their own thing and trying to effect change in Zimbabwe. But, New York is very far away from Zimbabwe. And also it's problematic that I'm white, to be honest. I mean, it's sort of like this has got to be a black struggle led by black people. I mean, and it has been. And I can help from behind the scenes and do other things. But, when you get to America, there's this extraordinary kind of, the extraordinary situation where the country whose foreign whose foreign policy matters most in the world because they can do most, they can project their power, has some of the least informed people in it. I mean, most Americans certainly couldn't find Zimbabwe on a map and wouldn't be that interested in it even if they could. And I understand that, Zimbabwe's not in their region and whatever, but America, can have an enormous impact. So yeah, I'm slightly resigned. I mean, I think I'm now cycling out of Zimbabwe. My last book, Exit Wounds, doesn't take place in Zimbabwe. I mean, the shadow of Zimbabwe, is cast over it, but it takes place between New York, London, and upstate in New York and Connecticut. And it's really a book about coming to terms with that and coming to terms with my own dueling identity. I've lived on 3 different continents now, and just sort of my place in the world, as it were.
How do you remain hopeful of the future of democratic reform?
Someone once said that one of the quickest ways to get rid of a kind of facile populist government is to let them into power, because they screw up very quickly. Because I'm really curious to see what happens with the Trump administration. There are very few people in it at a senior level who've had serious governmental experience on purpose. Trump has put people there because he wants to dismantle something. So he doesn't want people who are subscribed to that deep state or whatever. But running a country like America is very complicated. This is, you look at the Pentagon, look at the military bureaucracy. It's one of the biggest organizations in the world. Just the number of moving pieces. So on the one hand, there's a sort of sheer level of competence that's required, which I'm not convinced that the incoming people have. So that will be interesting. I think these things go in cycles. I really do. I mean, you saw it happening in Poland, where right-wing government comes in and then people see it for what it is and vote it out. I think that democracy, the genius of democracy is its ability to renew itself. And it's more or less unique in political systems. I think it was Churchill who said, democracy is the worst kind of political philosophy apart from all the others. That it is messy, as we said, and it isn't pretty, but it has this way of renewing itself. And if a party in a common government strays too far away from the consensus, it ends up losing elections. At least it does in fairly run elections. So I am still hopeful. I think something else is going to happen in countries like China, where they're starting to call it whatever, surveillance capitalism or surveillance communism, where you can see what people are thinking by monitoring Google searches and things. You can see very accurately what they actually think about things and what they're doing by their online habits. And if you're constantly monitoring that, you can actually respond to that in very quick time, in real time. And we've never been able to do that before. And I'm curious to see how that will affect political systems in the end. Because theoretically, you can now have a system where you have a fairly tyrannical leader, an autocratic leader, who is still able to respond, to see, first of all, what people are annoyed about or whatever, and respond. And so if they are able to respond, mostly what happens, I think, is that their hubris stops them from responding. But if they can get over that, it's possible that some of those systems will last longer than they might otherwise.
Wow. Fascinating. Peter Godwin, thank you. Thank you for this beautiful conversation.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
And welcome back to the show. I'm here with award-winning travel writer and filmmaker Simon Parker. Simon, hello and welcome to Sri Lanka and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
Simon, you're here in Sri Lanka and at the Galle Literary Festival to predominantly speak about your new book, A Ride Across America. Speak to us about some of the highlights of this journey that you took across America.
Yeah, so in 2016, I was actually commissioned by the BBC to sail and cycle halfway around the world. And that included cycling across the United States. And when I was cycling across the United States very, very slowly, I met all sorts of weird and wonderful Americans who gave me these incredible sound bites on what it was like living in a pre-election Trump election United States. So in around 2002, 2003, I decided I wanted to go back and do it again. So I decided to pick the two furthest points in the contiguous United States, which is the lower 48 states. And I cycled 4,500 miles across America. And the whole idea of this journey was to try and find voices of so-called real people, rather than just interviewing the town mayors, the politicians, the people working for think tanks. The whole idea of this journey was to try and meet farmers and artists and musicians and move very, very slowly. Because as a journalist, as a news producer, I think something we can be very, very guilty of is moving too quickly and only really creating very small snapshots of things. Whereas with 100 or 110,000 words and a 10-week journey across America, it really gave me an opportunity to get really stuck into things.
At present, we're looking at a Trump-led America, which is not looking too great for America or the world. How do you juxtapose the pre-Trump era and the voices that you spoke to from now?
Personally, I'm not remotely surprised at the outcome. I think when you looked at the popular vote in the United States after the election, you saw this very clear difference between a coastal United States and an inland United States, to such an extent that you had these sort of blue corners, but then you had this great swathe of red Republican voters in the middle. So I'm not remotely surprised, because many people living in Middle America, for example, interviewing Nebraskan farmers, they told me that the political classes of Washington didn't appeal to them, didn't speak to them, didn't resonate with them as individuals. So love him or hate him, Donald Trump has somehow managed to appeal to that quite homeless group of people who are predominantly in the middle of America.
Do you think that people have along the way lost sight of nuance? It's either black or white, where we seem to be at extreme ends of the same spectrum.
Yeah, that's exactly what my book's all about. So as a journalist, as someone who's worked on rolling news channels, as someone who uses social media, the algorithms are only ever trying to make things seem polarized one way or another. And actually life's not that complicated, or life, I should say, is more nuanced and more complicated than that. So, for example, what I wanted to try and prove with this book is that when you move slowly across the United States and you have real, proper, long-form conversations with people, rather than just speaking to people for 2 or 3 minutes, you can actually get stuck into things, and you can actually realize that people are a lot more together than the political system, newspapers, social media would have you to believe.
You spoke about the importance of speaking to real Americans. Could you help me understand the sense of empathy had by the people you spoke to?
Well, I think the problem is with the two-party system in the United States is that you kind of have to have a defined view on every single thing, whereas that means you're either you believe in climate change or you don't. And actually that's not a particularly healthy situation to be in, because, the big issues in society, the big issues in politics are just nowhere near as black and white or as cut and dry as that.
How do you think we can look at a more holistic worldview given the present context of a world that is at war?
I mean, it's becoming harder and harder. If you look at, for example, Donald Trump's policies on America First, this quite isolationist perspective on global politics in terms of America distancing itself from the rest of the world. I think it is going to become a lot harder for that unity to be created.
I'd like your perspectives on ecological dissonance. We don't situate ecological transformation in our discourses until quite recently when we've had to sit up and take notice of climate change. In your travels, in your documentation of the world across jurisdictions, what have you seen? What have you observed?
Well, I've seen that the world is hugely suffering. You look at widespread pollution and climate change, which I have seen firsthand. You see that there is a wild difference between how some countries are attempting to impact things like climate change in the way that others are not. That's an economic thing as well. You know, for some people in more developed countries, making steps towards, you know, being ecologically responsible is easier because they have the economic benefit of being in that situation. But then again, you look, you know, if some countries are going to completely ignore those, you know, making those positive steps forward, in contrast to what might be happening in the West, then, I mean, it's hard to be particularly positive for what's going to happen in the future.
Simon, how do you remain positive throughout all of this?
I believe in the power of people. As a journalist, I take solace in the idea that human beings are ultimately good people. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've traveled extensively around the world to over half the countries in the world. I am a firm believer in the fact that pretty much everyone on this planet is good. You might catch someone on a bad day, but I don't think there are dangerous people. I don't really think there are dangerous places. I always try and encourage people to travel and to see this world and meet people with their own eyes and have proper conversations. That's something which I'm trying to convey with this book, is that actually if you get out there and stop just scrolling through your phone and seeing this very sort of polarized version of the world, that actually the world is a lot richer, it's a lot more empathetic, it's a lot more interesting than perhaps people would lead you to believe.
The People's Platform.